Well, good day, everyone. Welcome again to Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm Lenny Esposito, and I'm excited to do something a little different today. We're going to be talking all things Tolkien. Of course, The Lord of the Rings has done nothing but grown in popularity since J.R.R. Tolkien first published it. It got a tremendous boost with Peter Jackson's treatment of the books in the films, something that Tolkien fans, of course, were waiting for many, many years, since previous attempts always seemed to fail. But how can we take this kind of literature, how can we take something that's kind of struck a nerve in the popular psyche and use it to further the kingdom of God? Well, my special guest, Dr. Freeman, is an expert in all things Tolkien, and that's what we're going to be talking about today on this. Come, let us reason together. Well, welcome everyone again. As I said, this is Lenny Esposito, and I'm excited to introduce you to a friend of mine, someone actually I've known for many years. We get together annually every time the Evangelical Theological Society meets. And we've been talking back and forth because we both have an interest in taking the cultural mores of our day, the ideas and the things that kind of strike passion in people's lives, and using them productively for the gospel. So Dr. Freeman has written a book called Tolkien Dogmatics, right? And he has a PhD from Trinity Evangelical Seminary. And I'm really excited to have this conversation, something you've probably not heard or thought about much before. So Austin, welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Hi, Lenny. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, again, as I said, I'm excited. We've gone back and forth. Of course, you knew that I was doing stuff with all the superheroes and how they were kind of resonating in the zeitgeist of the day. And you decided to go into Tolkien literature. Now, what first spurred you? I'm assuming you had a love of J.R.R. Tolkien for some time. So why don't you tell me about that?
So I started off, like probably a lot of our listeners, somebody, when I was around middle school age, handed me a copy of The Hobbit because they thought that I would like it. And I did, and I read it a couple grade levels ahead of time, and went on to Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and all sorts of things. But at the time, I wasn't really thinking about any of this sort of fantasy literature from a theological lens. And it wasn't really until graduate school that I started to notice that Tolkien's doctrine of evil maps really well onto a standard sort of Augustinian account of the theology of evil. And then I started doing some digging, and I found out that there were a lot of people doing really interesting work from the scholarly angle, investigating Tolkien as a theological writer. And that opened up a huge door for me. And I came back to Tolkien after many years, and that became sort of my new avenue of research. And I was doing this concurrently as I was in my PhD program, working on a doctrine of theological paradox and revelation and all these other stuff. But then I kept bringing Tolkien into everything, and to some people's delight and some people's chagrin, as it happens. But that's sort of been where I've landed, is that Tolkien opened up a whole world into medieval theology and classics and the engagement between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and he's a window into he's a starter drug into all sorts of other things, and that's where I've landed, is on the theology and literature side, and that's what I'm doing here at Houston Christian. And we have a lot of really strong Tolkien scholars over here. We got Holly Ordway, Michael Ward, other folks that all of us are getting together and chatting about this. And yeah, Tolkien keeps giving. It's one of those books. It's one of those worlds that people keep finding more and more to talk about, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's really interesting. Matter of fact, just yesterday I was talking to your colleague Melissa Kane Travis.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we did a podcast recording with the Kirkwood Center, who I'm also affiliated with. So we got to engage with her as well, and that's really neat because like she is a Hobbit, but that's another story. And so, interestingly, my first experience with Tolkien is basically that it was middle school, and we were in the GATE program. They didn't call it GATE. They called it the MGM program back then. And we were going through The Hobbit, and the school had planned a trip to the Renaissance Fair. So, you immerse yourself in The Hobbit so to get the vibe of the Renaissance Fair, because
That's great.
and of course that leads to the Lord of the Rings, and that leads to a reread of the Lord of the Rings. Well, I once read all 3 books in 6 days. Over one summer, I just had a week. I said, okay, I'm going to start to finish. Let's do this. So, but your point is that J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, because his scholastic acumen was so high, he was a linguist. He was very adept, especially at Nordic languages, right? Finnish and Scandinavian languages, things like that. That was where his academic career was based. But he understood, he and Lewis and some of the other folks, Inklings, understood that there was a very rich understanding of humanity in the mythology and the poetry and the literature of the medievals, right? As I understand it, Lewis had read basically every German poem, every English poem, he read them all in the original languages from the medieval period till what he was studying. So, and Tolkien, of course, he created these languages, and he was the first to have this truly robust world, I think. I don't know that matter of fact, it took science fiction writers about 30, 40 years to catch up to that. But because I think there's that depth in his academic understanding and his desire to make that a real world, I think that kind of spills through. What can you tell me a little bit about that and his impetus for writing, and how he crafted these things?
Sure. I think it really started as an overflow for him, a personal overflow of creativity. These stories were never really meant to be published. They were private or for particular audiences.
Weren't they for wasn't his son ill and he was writing letters to him in the...
There's various different circumstances depending on which work we're talking about. Okay. So when he's in the trenches in World War I, he's working on his private Elvish languages, and he believes, based on his theory of language, that a language needs a culture to be spoken in, and so now he's got a culture that Elvish language can be used by. And so he begins writing things like the Ainu Lindale, that's the creation myth that opens the Silmarillion, very early in the 19-teens. Wow. This is a private thing. He would share it with his wife Edith, and not really with anyone else, because he was self-conscious. And so one of the great piece of gratitude that we can have towards C.S. Lewis was the encouragement that other people would be interested in this other than him. And so for The Hobbit, he started as telling these stories to his children, bedtime stories, and then the manuscript got passed around to somebody that was in hospital, and it made its way into a publisher's desk and went on from there. And then neither The Hobbit nor The Lord of the Rings were planned in that sense. The Hobbit was never originally intended to be a part of that sort of Elvish stuff that Tolkien was doing on his own with his Elvish languages. It sort of foisted its way upon him as the story unfolded. And when he's writing The Hobbit, he had no plan for anything that was going on in The Lord of the Rings. He had to actually change the plot of The Hobbit in order to accommodate this idea that the One Ring belongs to Sauron and is this supremely evil and powerful weapon. So all of that falls out more or less organically as his life progresses. And in the meantime, as you mentioned, he is a full professor of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English at Oxford University. And his other colleagues are a little irritated with him because he works so slowly and perfectionistically. And instead of doing his peer-reviewed articles and his book contracts, he's doodling in the pages these Elvish crests and or tinkering with his private mythology. But it really opened up from this one man's private world that he didn't think anybody else was going to be interested in to this now truly global multi-billion-dollar phenomenon, because it tapped a nerve in the human psyche, I would say.
Yeah.
And I mean, these sorts of people, Tolkien and Lewis and their forebears like G.K. Chesterton or George MacDonald, these other folks, um, are really latching on to a particular, I don't want to say philosophy of literature, I want to say a theology of literature, and what it does and the role of the human author in relationship to God and the world. This is a very robust picture. They're not just sort of spinning out books that they think are going to sell. It's coming
Yeah.
from a deep place that of inner reflection on the craft of writing, that they're doing primarily for themselves, and not for fame or glory or money or anything else. And I think that genuineness also comes through, right? They're not seeking to be world famous contract authors. They're trying to tell stories that they believe are genuinely beautiful. And like C.S. Lewis says, if you aim for heaven, you get earth put in, but if you aim for earth, you get neither.
Yeah.
If you're J.R.R. Tolkien and you're aiming to tell a story that you find personally satisfying and beautiful, and with a message of the truth of the deep dimension of human nature, then you also end up resonating with all of the people that are reading it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. So lots of questions that come up. Of course, so what you said that really was Lewis that helped convince Tolkien to publish. Interestingly, it was Tolkien that helped Lewis to convert. So
Indeed.
it's a fascinating story. What was Tolkien's then religious background? Even and prior to World War One, did he grow up in a religious household? I know the war changed him. I know, and you can see or read even in some of the battle sequences, you can kind of feel the evil of war that he understood. And World War One was nasty. So when you see people dying, you get that. But yeah, how was his religious upbringing, and how did that influence and pour into his writings?
Yeah. So Tolkien was actually born in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Most people don't know that he is South African by birth. So his father died very early. His father died when he was a young child, before he could really remember it. And so they moved back. He and his brother and his mother moved back to England when he is as a young child, young enough to realize that England is in some sense his home, but not his home, right? This is a place that he is coming to, that he is told is his home, but he has never been to before. And so going from South Africa to the lush green land of England at that time was very formative on him. And so his mother converted to Roman Catholicism when the boys were young. And at the time in British culture, this would have been similar to becoming a communist or something. It was just very, very ostracized. I mean, Tolkien was born in 1893, and it was only the generation before that Catholics were allowed to vote and hold public office in the United Kingdom. So this was a very, very formative experience for him. And he credits the stress of being cut off from her family and her support network to his mother's untimely death when Tolkien was a young teenager. And so he is not a cradle Catholic. He is a convert. But he is raised as a young teenager and onward into adulthood by a priest, Father Francis Morgan, a Spaniard, who was the secretary for John Henry Newman there at the Birmingham Oratory. And for those of you that would like more information about Tolkien's spiritual background in that extent, then one of my colleagues, Holly Ordway, has a brand new book that just released, I think last week, on Tolkien's faith and the spiritual biography of that. So he is very conscious that he is something of an outsider as a young Catholic man in England. As an orphan, as a poor man at private school, he's very much on the outs from the social world that he would have been surrounded by, and so he has I think a very rich internal life for that reason. and his imagination perhaps flourishes in that sort of a context. But he's deeply, deeply loyal to the Catholic Church. And I mean, many people could psychoanalyze him and say that it's because of the death of his mother, but I think Tolkien would say that's probably part of it. But part of it is just because he believes that's what's true. And he is staunchly Catholic for the rest of his life. C.S. Lewis is a mere Christian. Tolkien is not. Tolkien is a Roman Catholic Christian, which is not to say he's not ecumenical. He was part of very many ecumenical societies and dialogues around Oxford University at the time. But yeah, so he moves very swiftly from Oxford into the battlefields of World War I. And for those people that are interested in reading more about Tolkien's experiences in World War I, the place to go to would be John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War. That's the award-winning volume that sort of traces all of Tolkien's deployments and where he would have been and what he would have seen. And he continues to be surrounded by untimely deaths for that reason. Two of his three best friends die in the war. And he finds himself, again, with this intense sense of loyalty to people that are now gone, that he and his friends are part of this society, this club that they formed called the TCBS, Tea Club and Barovian Society. But basically, it's a literary club where they read their works to each other. And they believe, as many young men did in the Edwardian period, that they were going to be a part of this renaissance or revival of a rich Christian culture in the United Kingdom at the time. And so he feels as if he's sort of left carrying the torch for those other men that have died. And in some sense, he feels like his own private works or his own private poems, which is what he started out with, and his fiction is carrying on a legacy. But yeah, he is always something of the odd man out because of his background and because of his religious faith. I mean, when C.S. Lewis comes to Oxford, he's got a very famous letter. It says, when I got here, I was told never to trust a philologist or a Roman Catholic, and Tolkien was both. Despite that, I think that Tolkien's close-knit community of friends like C.S. Lewis and Lewis's brother Warney and other people like that are going to be very important for him. And you're going to see that in his stories, these small groups of very dedicated, loyal people that are on a mission in an otherwise much grander, hostile story. I think that there's something of his background in that.
Yeah. And so, unlike Lewis, though, Tolkien wasn't trying to create an analogy in his matter of fact, he kind of despised those kinds of ideas. Even though Lewis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's almost a parable that Lewis is building. Tolkien wanted to just do something different that maybe, but it was permeated with a deep Christianity, and it was that, and maybe that's why it makes it so universal. Maybe that's why Tolkien. I mean, Lewis's books, Narnian books, of course, were popular as well, but they didn't seem to have the same cachet as Tolkien, especially with adults, until maybe 20, 30 years ago. Why do you think that is?
So to begin with, yes, Tolkien and Lewis are doing very different things in their books. Just because they're fantasy worlds, it does not mean that they're on the same mission. So for Lewis, he's doing what he calls a supposal. Suppose that Jesus Christ becomes incarnate in a place like Narnia with talking animals and witches. What would it look like? What sort of an incarnation would that be? But for Tolkien, because of his theology of literature, he wants to rely less on the author constructing these hidden meanings and more on allowing those meanings to arise from the shared human psyche, we might say. So For Tolkien, he says that the Christian elements are subsumed into the story and into the metaphysics itself, the metaphysics of the world, right? So the nature of good and evil, or what does real victory look like? What does real sacrifice look like? Those are the Christian elements. Because for Tolkien, he says Middle Earth is our world. It is not a separate dimension the way that Narnia is. It is our world in a mythic past. And so if God has not revealed himself to Abraham, if Jesus Christ has not become incarnate, then you can't talk about anything to do with revealed religion yet. It would be anachronistic. It would spoil the setting of the story. It's like in Blazing Saddles or whatever, when they drive off in the sunset in a Cadillac, right? That it takes you out of the story. And Tolkien really believes that the genre of myth speaks to something within the image of God in which human beings are created. He does not want artistically to jar people out of that experience. And so he's got to walk a very fine line. Yeah, Tolkien does not like allegory, but he's defining allegory in an idiosyncratic way there. I think when most people hear Tolkien say he cordially dislikes allegory in all its forms, what they take him to mean is, don't look for any deeper meaning in my story. It's just a story. Right. There's a person on my Amazon book page that gave me a 1-star review because they said Tolkien didn't intend any meaning behind any of this, which is of course ridiculous, right? All authors that are good at their craft want some subtext there. What he means is allegory in the sense of a one-to-one correspondence that the author controls, right? So a sort of a secret decoder ring approach to fiction. Instead, Tolkien believes that God has intentionally freighted the world with this hidden depth of meaning, this sort of transcendence that he's picking up from the Romantic authors. And if we confine it to a one-to-one correspondence, then we're actually making it a lot more shallow than we would if we were to leave it to the audience's own personal interpretation. And that's not to say that Tolkien is a reader response literary theorist. He just doesn't want to close those things off. I think we can picture what Tolkien's doing as a sort of a box with an open top, right? He wants to bound the symbols in a certain way. He wants to direct us to look at a certain place, but he is perfectly willing to have that overflow into other forms of meaning. So the ring is not the atom bomb. The ring is not Nazism or anything like that. He very specifically says that. But the ring has applicability to all sorts of things like the atom bomb or Nazism or things that Tolkien could not have foreseen, publishing The Lord of the Rings in 1954. So he's leaving it open for other people to see this sort of form of evil and fill that in with their own personal content. So that's where we have to look. If we're looking for Christianity in The Lord of the Rings, we've got to look at the form, or what he calls the shape of the story. And we can then apply whatever contemporary content we have into that form. The nature of Frodo's failure at Mount Doom applies to us today just as much as it did when Tolkien was writing, because it's not tied to a particular code. It is just a universal sort of human archetype, and that's where he sees the power of the story working.
Yeah, I think you're on to something here. One of the things that Tolkien seems to trade in is really concepts of morality, good and evil, and he understands the failures. Matter of fact, he's particularly hard on the human race. They're the ones that seem to, right? Even though the age of man is ascending at the end, it's like, but men are often failures, and he understands also that sometimes you do the right thing because it's the famous Gandalf quote, when Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," and Gandalf, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time given us," which is, that's so countercultural even to today's standards, right? It's like, no, I need to express me. And he's so there is a Christian ethos there. One of the things that I'm pretty sure we talked about before is how the history of myth prior to Christ was so radically different. How the main character in the Greek plays or Homer was usually the aristocracy. It's Theseus, it's Odysseus, it's Sophocles. It's the individual who has a rightful position, and he's either trying to get back to that rightful position, a la Sophocles, who got thrown out, or Perseus, who was captured. Or he's on a quest to better himself in some way, like Odysseus, like the Argonauts, right? To challenge himself and to gain riches and to come home a more weathered and experienced individual. Nobody cared about the commonality. Matter of fact, Aristotle says the slaves deserve to be slaves. You don't, if you don't own land, you shouldn't be able to vote, right? And he has a very distinctive case system there. And
women are imperfect men.
Yes,
yeah, all kinds So it's sort of shocking that Tolkien's method here is a sort of double-edged sword, because he's working so much at the level of natural law and natural theology, that many people don't want to admit that there is more going on in the story. So if you look on any sort of internet Tolkien website or the scholarly Tolkien associations, it's very much like, keep your God out of my Lord of the Rings. We don't want anything to do with this. And there are all sorts of people that jump through interpretive hurdles to try to make the Lord of the Rings not mean what Tolkien said it meant. For instance, that the Lord of the Rings is primarily about God and his sole right to be worshipped. Tolkien says that. That's what he says the book is about. And so you have people that want to bring in all sorts of things about, well, we can't really know the author's intention behind a work. It's more in the realm of the community as it interprets the work. Yeah. And like, well, I seem to understand you when you tell me I can't understand Tolkien that way. Right. You see, it seems to be perfectly perspicuous when you want to talk about the parts of the Lord of the Rings you like. And then when we get to the areas that make you uncomfortable because it challenges your theological presuppositions, all of a sudden Tolkien is confusing and opaque. It doesn't really make sense to me. It seems to be a good for me, but not for thee sort of approach. And it's really prevalent, and it really strikes a nerve with people because they love these stories so much, right? They wouldn't call it gatekeeping, but I think that's what it is that they really do want to keep what they have found in this story. And what's sad is they don't understand, or they don't have enough of an experience of Christianity to realize that Christianity fulfills and completes the things that they have found in this story. Right? They see Christianity in this straw man form as in competition with, as this bigoted, intolerant, outdated, unsophisticated, anti-intellectual thing that is going to reduce and cheapen what Tolkien is doing, when in fact they have this inchoate desire within themselves, this longing that Christianity is the only thing that's actually going to fulfill and intellectually satisfy. So there, I mean, there's people that find transcendence in these stories. There is a documentary called Ringers. It's narrated by Dominic Monaghan, and they're interviewing people that make this pilgrimage. And I mean, it's a religious pilgrimage
Wow.
to the set in The Lord of the Rings, all the way down in New Zealand. And they talk about how it's this life-changing experience for them, and that they have to go because it plays such a big part in their lives. And I mean, they're looking for something. There is something of ultimate meaning that they're finding in this world that Tolkien has made. And it's sad to me, and it is a charge to me to show people that the world that the Lord of the Rings portrays is not simply beautiful; it is also true and real.
Have you been to New Zealand?
No, never been to New Zealand.
So
yet.
As I understand it, that when you get to the Wellington Airport or Auckland Airport, there are two statues inside the airport. The first is of Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to scale Mount Everest. The other is of Peter Jackson, because no single individual did more to not only put New Zealand on the map, but the economic boon from those films, and just making them employed like half the nation, and then the secondary. And I'm maybe because he's a New Zealander, I thought it was naive that he had initially were surprised that people were pilgrimaging to the Shire, and so when they decided to do the full Hobbit remake, that they would build it with permanent material so that people could visit it. Yeah, it's like, wow, we didn't even realize what we had here. But and he did do a very good job because I mean, I remember, right, when I was growing up, you were dying to see, and we did the Rankin Bass cartoon version, which was rough. And not only was it rough, it stopped like halfway through the story, and you're like, what happened? Wait. And so there was a lot of attempts, but nobody did it right. So
and I really feel for Peter Jackson as well in the Hobbit situation.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not his fault. The previous director walks out at the last minute. He's trying to, because he loves this world, he's trying to come in and salvage what he can. But if you listen to the commentaries, I mean, for the original Lord of the Rings films, they had 4 or 5 years of lead time.
Yeah, they had a ton of prep time. Yeah.
But he says, and so he can really craft it. But based on the shooting schedule for the Hobbit movies, he said they were storyboarding and shooting on laying planks down in front of a moving train. And that's not the way Peter Jackson wanted to do it either. That's just the way he had to do it. And so he's trying to make the best of a bad situation. So I think there's a good film in there, and there are quite a lot of fan edits that take out all of the extraneous bits, including particular elf characters that fall in love with dwarves, and not to be named. But yeah, it's just. It's a bad situation, but what I really do admire about his attempts with those movies was his absolute respect for the fan community that he had helped develop in the first 3 movies. Bringing people onto set to be extras that would really mean a lot to them. People with permanent disabilities, and these sorts of people that it's a life-changing experience to be a part of, and to make it this community effort, this community project, just try to sort of give back to the people that have dedicated so much. I was a really admirable sort of thing that he did. And then we got Rings of Power. So there's a whole different thing.
That's a whole, yeah. And I do want to talk about that. But at first I want to ask you, tell me about the Orcs. Okay, so here's an evil race. And of course you get the 2.0 version, the Uruk-hai.
Yeah.
But what was the motivation there? Is it just you need an evil character? Is this an idea of the general demise of civilization that happens. How do the orcs fit into this concept?
So Tolkien never settles on what the orcs are like ontologically or where they come from. There are lots of theories that he sort of floats and tries out to see if they work, but he never really comes down on a final answer. Remember that when he's beginning to write these stories, whether it's his private Silmarillion drafts or whether it's The Hobbit, he hasn't really yet reached the stage where he's consciously reflecting on what am I doing when I'm making a fantasy story. When he starts doing that, he's writing on fairy stories, which is it's a series of lectures that he's giving at St. Andrews University. And so On Fairy Stories comes out between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and it sort of crystallizes for him his methodology in writing this sort of fantasy. And he says, looking back on The Hobbit, there are a lot of things that I regret. Yeah, I wouldn't have named the trolls, Bert and Tom, and I wouldn't have had X, Y, and Z. And yet, so he's bound by the canon that he has created, right? So if it's published and if he says that's part of the world, he now has to work within those constraints, even if he would prefer not to. And so the idea of the orcs or the goblins, which is two words for the same thing, more or less, is probably one of those ideas. So theologically, he's very aware that there is no such thing as an evil race, and there can't be because God only makes good things. So the devil or Sauron or Morgoth can corrupt individuals, right? Individuals can fall, but a whole race cannot just be cursed like that to fall. Only God has that power. And so you find Tolkien talking about this in late writings, such as the debate of Finrod and Andreth, which is this sort of philosophical dialogue between Galadriel's brother Finrod and this elderly human woman, Andreth, about human mortality. And why is it that humans die? And Andreth says humans weren't meant to die. We were supposed to be immortal. Something happened to us. And Finrod's trying to figure out what it could be, and his conclusion is you must have displeased Eru, God, somehow. This is not something that Morgoth could have done. So what do we do with the orcs? You never meet a good orc. It seems like they're just there to be killed, and to a degree that is a valid critique, right? That people say, well, the orcs are this sort of inherent racism in Tolkien's stories or this imperialism. But you have passages in Tolkien where he says orcs are more like subject to the Geneva Convention, right? Like that orcs are subject to the rules of war and that they should be given mercy if it is begged. He says, well, were the orcs elves that were twisted and sort of genetically engineered and bred into this deformed new race? Or were they Maiar? Were they these sort of demonic spirits that construct and inhabit bodies for themselves and then sort of begin to propagate? Are they not elves but human beings, right? They already have this evil nature, this fallenness within themselves because of the result of original sin. And so then Sauron and Morgoth just sort of amplify that. Is it an inbreeding between the elves and the men to create this new race of corrupted beings? He's floating all of these different ideas to try to theologically justify why the orcs exist the way they do. And so when we talk about what Tolkien's doing with orcs, we have to distinguish between inside the text and outside of the text, right? So the in-universe explanation, he never really settles down on how the orcs came to be. Out of the universe, Tolkien would just say, theologically, that's not correct. It's just part of the story. We've got to work with what we have. He's very, very clear in his published letters that there are no such things as orcs in real life, right? There is no race or group of people that are irredeemably evil by nature. And he says, right, there are just as many orcs on the English side in World War II as there are, not just as many, but there are some. That there are particular cultures that are more prone to evil at particular times, right? The Nazi Germany would be one of those things. But he says, let us be under no illusions that it's an us versus them thing, and that all of the bad guys are over there and all of the good guys are over here. Very resistant to that sort of thinking. So that's one of those elements where Tolkien would forthrightly say, I think, that theologically this is something that I'm having to wrangle with and come up with a sort of ex post facto justification for. Not this is how I really believe the real world operates, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's really important because, and again, you're showing how when he formulates the story, and I completely understand this if you're coming off of a diet of ancient mythology, you have these bad actors, these characters, these races that pull. This is standard, especially in non-Christian theologies across much of the pagan world. Definitely in the Norse tradition and things like that. But so you craft something that sounds like it, and then when you're starting to say, okay, I need to take this a little bit more distinctly, a little bit more organizationally, and make it astute. Oh, now I've got an issue that I've got to deal with. But notice that he's doing that intentionally. He's actually thinking through it,
yeah.
Which goes to your previous point that you can't just say, leave your God out of my Tolkien, because it doesn't work. Tolkien's wrestling, the things that he's wrestling with are the very issues of theology that drive this world. So that's important. So now let's talk about the Rings of Power, and how modern society is taking Tolkien and maybe moving him in a way that I don't know that he would want to be moved. So I watched the first episode. I was nonplussed. But what's your response, and how has it been received in the broader Tolkien community?
Polarized. So the Rings of Power is a sort of a litmus test for a lot of Tolkien fans. And you're going to find it's going to be very difficult to find someone that is evaluating it for itself. You're going to have a lot of people coming with preconditions based on their other personal assumptions that the Rings of Power is absolutely garbage and there are no redeemable qualities to it because it is woke. And then from the other side, you've got people that say that the Rings of Power is absolutely spectacular because it is more in line with how they believe Tolkien should be read in this sort of non-Christian or post-Christian way. And so for me, as I try to exercise intellectual charity and interpret the Rings of Power the way the creators would like us to interpret it, I find myself very very frustrated, very perplexed. So I think that there were good things about Rings of Power. I think that the Numenor episodes were probably the best episodes in the season. I think some of the visuals are very beautiful. I think some of the themes of fathers and sons were quite nice in the story. And every once in a while, there's a hint that somebody knows a good bit about the background of Tolkien. So for instance, a lot of the orcs, they have these Mongol-inspired armor. Which tells you, okay, well, somebody went through and did the work of reading Tolkien's letters and seeing where he's drawing his inspiration from these sorts of invading hordes in European consciousness. And then there's other stuff that just doesn't make sense to me in terms of plotting. So I'm not as frustrated with them sort of collapsing the timeline down because it is a different type of story than the Silmarillion is, right? That genre necessitates form. And so if you're going to tell an 8 or whatever episode TV series, you can't have a time span of several thousand years. You've got to alter it somewhat, right? That's just par for the course. But things like having this mysterious stranger who is probably maybe Gandalf show up, and that doesn't make sense to me. That seems to be. I don't want to judge people who I don't know, but that seems to be artistically disingenuous, right? We need somebody with some name recognition to pull in the casual fans, and so if we shove Gandalf in there, then everybody will love it, right? That's not the right way to craft a piece of artwork. That's the way to craft a product,
right?
And I think Tolkien would be very much against that. There's a character arc with Galadriel that a lot of people are mad about. I think that's probably the biggest criticism, is Galadriel is kind of mean and bratty. I don't see an issue with that. I think that there is a character arc for her in that first season, and that we're seeing her grow into something, or at least that's, optimistically, that's what I hope is happening. But in terms of that depth dimension that I was talking about earlier, that makes it resonate with people, the Rings of Power strikes me as very hollow, because I don't think they have a firm grasp on what goodness looks like. And I think that's also the reason why we saw so many decades of superhero movies, but we've sort of been marveled out. We find these movies not really having as much of an impact as they did when they first came out. Superman is boring to most people nowadays because Superman is a mirror to what our concept of goodness is.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a coherent concept of goodness, then we can't tell compelling stories about good characters. In most modern media, people are more fascinated by the bad guys than they are the good guys. You've got your Darth Vader lunchbox that the first graders carrying around, and which always kind of is weird to me. Like he's a genocidal dictator, like, and you're carrying him to elementary school. But anyway, like but if you look at the Lord of the Rings, I mean, yeah, the Nazgul, they're cool, they're fun, but the people actually are really invested in characters like Gandalf and Aragorn and Boromir and Theoden and all of these people. This is a really compelling, attractive form of goodness, and there isn't really a compelling vision of that in Rings of Power, because if you're a relativist, you can't have that.
I don't even. I think they don't even know where to start. Here's a fascinating piece that I noticed. If you watch Disney's Fantasia, which is a phenomenal work, really is. There's the Night at Bald Mountain scene, right, where you have the Balrog rise, the Cherboog, and the demons and ghosts are swirling around. Well drawn, you feel it and all that. And then they contrast that with Ave Maria. And I'm watching the Ave Maria, and it's very ethereal. It's very the scene is very pulled back. You just have hazy figures way in the distance with lights, who are just kind of on a processional march. And I'm going, isn't it interesting that even at that point we can detail evil so well? We can draw the specifics of it so carefully and so richly. We don't have any concept of how to draw good. And so from that point forward, it's why what concerned me, especially about a decade ago, when you started to see this significant rise of the anti-hero. So you have the Dexters, right? You have Deadpool. You have Maleficent gets her own movie, and she's simply a victim, and that's what makes her mean and bad, and there's still a code that, right, Dexter can only kill people who are supposedly worse than him, even though he's a serial killer. You wouldn't think that there's too many degradations below that, but they seem to try and find those. But it's a very relativistic approach, and that's why the Samwise Gamgee character really comes through as he's the one who's actually the hero in that story, because, as you say, Frodo ultimately, he should be credited for his determination and dedication to the destruction of the ring, but at the end the pull of evil is so hard on him that he couldn't do it himself. And it was and it's, to use a theological concept, God uses the orders of the day to get you where he wants, and then he executes
and
it.
The author of the story takes over, and by that I do not mean myself.
That's right.
Tolkien said.
That's right.
But notice that that doesn't negate Frodo's agency, because God uses secondary causes. And what happens is, when God is writing this story, Frodo's prior consistent acts of mercy towards Gollum, which then spill over into Sam. Sam also spares Gollum's life several times, are the means by which Gollum shows up there at that pivotal moment and is able to destroy the ring.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you. We have just a few minutes, but I do want to say, what has the international reaction to this been? Because you have to translate this into different languages and things like that. How do different cultures, and even non-Christian cultures, how do they resonate with these concepts? And do they do so more aptly than, say, a C.S. Lewis in Narnia?
Yeah, that's a hard question. There are particular international Tolkien communities that are very strong, and then there are some that I haven't really heard as much about. So I'll mention a few, and most of them are European, which would make sense, just because that's the cultural background that Tolkien is writing this for. So there's a very strong Italian Tolkien community, very strong German Tolkien community. There is a pretty sizable Russian Tolkien community, but because of the history of Russia and communism, it has its own sort of weird angle on things. Like there were no official translations of The Lord of the Rings for a good while. People had to do these underground translations that were of varying levels of quality. And so what you find, that sort of makes sense. So in Italy, we've got this very Catholic, traditional country, that Tolkien's pre-Vatican II idealism sort of appeals to. You've got Germany and the Germanic, or in Tolkien's case, Anglo-Saxon sort of heroism, and then America. And even Tolkien was a little taken aback by the American reaction to The Lord of the Rings, and more or less implied that a lot of American fans were crazy, which they were at the time, and still are. So it is an international phenomenon in the sense that that there are a lot of people that see themselves reflected in that story, and I think the danger of that is you can go two ways, right? You can see yourself reflected in the story and then continue to just make Tolkien or his intentions into your own image and disregard areas in which he differs from you, for example, theology. Or you can see in that thing a Tolkien in conversation with you about those differences, and pulling you or attracting you to something. And in our current cultural context, I see a lot more of the first one than I see of the second one. So the Tolkien Society is international. It has a lot of people from different places, Poland and other areas, and it's very peculiar to what extent the standards and practices of the progressive European university have infiltrated the interpretation of Tolkien and his works. So I see a very strong push recently to incorporate LGBT, transgender, all sorts of themes into Tolkien. And when I point out the fact that Tolkien, as a traditional Roman Catholic growing up from 1893 onward, would not have wanted that, right? He would have disagreed with that approach, and they basically say, "Well, prove it."
Wow.
And so I see a growing disconnect between the author's intention and then the reader's interpretation, or we could say a difference between our viewing The Lord of the Rings as the work that Tolkien intended it to be, and me taking it for what I want it to be, right? So, or fan reception is another way to say that.
Very postmodern in its approach.
Yeah. So I don't have a problem with people reading The Lord of the Rings in a way that is fun and entertaining for them, or that's personal satisfying for them. They're perfectly free to do that. Where I do have a problem is confusing that for what Tolkien actually means to do. And again, their response is, well, it's impossible to know what Tolkien actually meant. And to me, that's an absolutely incoherent view, right? Like we can't talk about what Tolkien meant without implying that you and I are succeeding in communicating what we mean to one another, right? Like that's just how conversation works. The reason you're mad at me for disagreeing with you is because you successfully understand what I meant here, you know, and it to me it is intellectually dishonest, and that is what I have a problem with.
Fair enough. Okay, so tell me just quickly, what is Tolkien dogmatics then? Tell me about that.
So dogmatics arises as a result of these sorts of conversations. So there are a lot of books on spiritual themes in The Lord of the Rings, or spiritual readings of The Lord of the Rings, a lot of very good books. There was no book yet that dealt not with the Lord of the Rings, spiritual themes in The Lord of the Rings, but with J.R.R. Tolkien as a theological thinker. And then, so I start in Tolkien dogmatics with the reverse of what most people have been doing. I begin with his primary world works, right? His letters, his lectures, other things, and then use his Middle-earth material as a way of fleshing out or filling out these concepts of what he says he believes about theology in the real world. And so it's organized as a systematic theology, and it's more or less a clearinghouse, a pretty exhaustive clearinghouse of everything that Tolkien said on each of these topics of theology. And so that I lay out the limitations in the introduction, and I say, look, this doesn't say what Tolkien exhaustively believed. We only have what is published. There are a lot of things that are still not published, right? There is a document in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, Tolkien's History of the Church in England, that's just sitting there and that has not been released to the public, right? So there is more. Just because Tolkien doesn't talk a lot about Scripture in his primary writings doesn't mean that he does or doesn't have a strong doctrine of Scripture. So we're only working with what we have. But from what we have, it turns out that we can create an entire systematic theology based on what Tolkien said. And how strange is it then that we have so many people saying that Tolkien's personal theology is totally irrelevant to his project here in The Lord of the Rings or elsewhere, or that Tolkien is somehow not interested in these sorts of questions and conversations. And so the book has several hundred footnotes, right? That interested readers, whether they agree or disagree with me, I just urge you, go ad fontes to the sources, go to Tolkien's works themselves, and make an argument and agree with me or disagree with me about the picture that I've put forward. But the Tolkien dogmatics is, if you want to know more or less everything that Tolkien has published about any element of theology, there it is, and let's begin a conversation from that point.
Wow, that sounds great. Now we will link to that book in the description, so you can get it, and hopefully you'll be able to move to a direction on Tolkien that you probably never thought about before. So that's really exciting. What other things would you want people to know as we begin to close? What haven't we said that maybe we should say
about Tolkien,
or the broader role of this type of literary approach to changing our world, really?
Yeah. So this is sort of our brand at HCU is cultural apologetics, imaginative apologetics, and I see that as a sort of a two-step process. Most people nowadays do not have the intellectual background to really have even like a content to words like God or sin or angel or virtue, right? Like it's a word that can be used, but it is a meaningless word to most people. Very vague, very watered down, and it's just not plausible. They don't see how it can fit plausibly into their world, into their lived experience in a way that makes sense. They sometimes they filled it with the wrong content, right? God is a sort of judgmental dictator that's going to come down on you if you have any fun. And so what literature can do specifically is create an attractive world that is based upon these principles. So for instance, most modern people would find the idea of angels interacting in the world or ridiculous, right? They would say that's silly, right? We can't believe in that anymore. But then you read about the Valar and about Gandalf and all of these people, and you're like, oh, okay, that would be cool, right? I get that. And so we can use literature or pop culture or these, Narnia, Lord of the Rings, as an avenue for fleshing out these concepts for people, and bringing the defenses down for people to say that is attractive, and I am in favor of that in the abstract, and I wish that were true even. And then we can follow up with that and bring in classical theistic arguments or more traditional forms of apologetics to say, well, guess what? As Tolkien says in the epilogue to On Fairy Stories, that this is the myth that has become fact, right? This is the world that you found so attractive, and it really exists, right? That sort of meaning, that sort of hope that you can find really is there for you in Christ. And so that's where I think our opportunity is to re-persuade people through the imagination, through creative works, to then have a receptivity to questions about truth or falsity in religion. I think that's a path that is opening up before us. It's an opportunity we should take.
Yeah, it's the very phrase he used with C.S. Lewis, the true myth. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is it strikes at the center of something else that's we are impoverished with today, and that is the idea of the beautiful. Mm-hmm. And really, it shows these kinds of approaches show the beauty of Christianity in its fully developed sense. And we don't, again, it's kind of, nobody wants a world that's less than beautiful, right? Beauty is to be obtained, and what is the actual beautiful? It's a transcendental property. It's the good and the true and the beautiful. And I think this is how you can communicate that. It's definitely because people, as you had said before, have these preconceptions, these strawmen resignations against Christianity. And I tell people the problem isn't that we're turning into a pagan culture. The problem is that we are turning into a post-Christian pagan culture. The first generations, right? It's all of the Romans and the people that were witness to reacted very much like the Athenians did to Paul. What is this strange thing that this guy's talking about? What's this new idea that I've not heard before? Today, everybody says, oh, I've heard it and I know it and it's not a big deal, but they really haven't heard it. They don't know it. And how do we get that in? And it's approaches like these that you can use to kind of reduce those barriers, as you say.
And I think the situation is even worse than that. They don't know it, but they think they do, right. And they don't hear it. So you talk about Paul and Mars Hill, and what is he doing there? He is finding common ground. He's quoting their literature. He's quoting their poets to say, this is what we're talking about. But the place that I point people when they want to understand what imaginative apologetics is with David and Bathsheba, and the prophet Nathan comes to David, and David knows that he has committed a sin. He does not want to admit it to himself. Mm-hmm. He's on to something that he does not want to let go. His ears are shut. And so what does Nathan do? He tells David a story. He says, imagine that there is a man who had a little lamb, right? And he tells him this story about this man's pet lamb that gets snatched by a ruthless wealthy landowner and killed even when he doesn't need it. And that outrages David. And David goes along with Nathan. Now he's on Nathan's side. And he says, this man deserves to die. And that's when Nathan says, you are the man. And that's when David's hearts change.
Yes.
So yeah, I think to varying degrees, right? It doesn't have to be quite so aggressive as that, but to varying degrees, that's the way to do it. Is what Kierkegaard would call that indirect discourse, what C.S. Lewis calls sneaking past watchful dragons, right? You find the way into people's loves, into their affections, and then their mind begins to be receptive.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Well, this has been wonderful, Austin. Thank you so much for the time. Again, we'll link to the book. Any closing thoughts or anything else that we need to?
Yeah, I'll put in my shameless plug here. So we have a master's degree in apologetics here at Houston Christian University. We're always looking for good students to come and literally study things like the Lord of the Rings with me and with other people, Lou Marcos. I mentioned Holly Ordway and Michael Ward and all these other folks that if you want to come and study this way of doing apologetics and theology, then we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great. We'll put again. We'll link to the school as well. So thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, and hope to see you in a couple of months.
Absolutely. Bye.
All right. Bye. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.